Good evening. We're continuing with my series on uh, Fabiano Caruana at the 2014 Sinkfield Cup. His remarkable achievement in winning 7 games in a row. So far, he's beaten Veselin Topalov, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, and Magnus Carlsen. World's top 10 players, all of them. And of course, Carlsen is the highest rated player of all time. Now, in the 4th round, he's playing against Levon Aronian. He was at that time Armenian, but is now American. Let's see what happens. So Caruana plays e4, Aronian e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5, the so-called Roy Lopez or Spanish opening. a6, the Morphy defends, puts a question to the bishop. Do you want to take this knight or not? Caruana answers, we'll see. So Aronian develops his knight, Caruana castles and says, yeah, take that pawn if you want, you can have that pawn, give me the open e-file. Caruana says, no thanks. Aronian says, no thanks, and partly closes the e-file. So Caruana is forced to defend the e-pawn. And the b-pawn comes forward and attacks the bishop, which retreats to b3, and he castles. Now often we see c3 here to give the bishop this c2 square, but here Caruana chooses another line, the so-called Martinez variation, which is perfectly fine, perfectly playable, especially if you happen to be a top GM. Now Aronian doesn't want to go ahead and attack the bishop here with knight to a5, because then this pawn drops, and that isn't great for him. So he defends the pawn first. Now he's trying to play a5 and attack the bishop. So Caruana makes room for the bishop, preserving the very important Spanish bishop on b3. So he plays knight to a5 and forces another move out of the bishop. Now he plays bishop to e6, and this bishop has moved 1, 2, 3, 4 times, and Aronian comes out with a bishop that's just moved once, and Caruana takes it. So it gets taken back, and now, you know, those 4 moves, 3 of them have disappeared, only 2 because they had to take it back. So Caruana has lost a little bit of time by this, but he believes he's got a better pawn structure, and he has. And he plays bishop b4 to attack the knight to get another tempo back. And the knight comes to c6. It's taken 2 moves to get to c6. Sorry, 1, 2, 3 moves to get to c6, where it could have just taken 1. So that gets him a tempo back. And he plays bishop to d2 to continue his development. But if we see, Aronian just needs to play the queen onto the second rank, and he's finished with his development. And so he's actually a move ahead of Caruana in development, but he doesn't have a particularly good move for his queen on this move, so it isn't such a big advantage. He plays d5, and the rook comes onto the e-file, looking particularly at this pawn. Queen comes to d6. No, once the pawn had moved, the queen had a decent move to develop, and then takes it to d6. And the knight comes to a2, very out of the way. But if we see in this position, the knight comes to b7. See d7, he's got to try and rearrange his pieces, and the queen comes to e2. If we see in this position, Caruana has a more centralized rook and more centralized pressure on the e-file, but Aronian has more centralized knight, so it's about even, I would guess. The pawn comes to d4, but now this pawn becomes a weakness, and most of the rest of the game will be about attacking these 2 pawns, here and here. Rook comes to b1. That so as the rooks can keep in contact with one another whilst the knight comes to c1 and then b3 or e2. Knight comes to b6 and the knight comes to c1, looking at possibly e2 but more likely b3 to come to c5. Knight comes to a4, looking possibly at playing here and making another weakness in white's pawn structure. Knight comes to b3 anyway, and the rook moves, ready to double up. The rook moves to c1 to support this pawn, maybe so that he can push here, and if it takes on, pass on, takes, and then knight takes, and then rook takes knight, and then everything's peachy for white. So Aronian plays d8 so that if those exchanges happen, then this pawn is attacked twice by the rook and queen and stands in a weak position to discourage Caruana from playing c4, which would liberate his position. So the knight comes to g5 to attack the rook. Of course, Caruana can take, but then Aronian can take, but then Caruana takes back and gets an attack on this rook immediately. And then we're no longer talking about a situation where white is behind black in development and black's just got the weaker pawn structure to try and defend. So he defends the pawn on e6. I know it was defended by the queen, but the queen can be distracted. The queen comes to h5 to attack the pawn on h7. Black would like to play rook here to chase the queen away and take possession of this semi-open file, but he can't because the queen would come to f7 and say check, and then the knight would be able to move and attack exposing a attack on the rook. So the pawn moves and attacks the queen. And the knight backs up and he doubles up his rooks, as we talked about. The rook comes here to support the f2 pawn, and the rooks double up. It's not so much to double the rooks up, but it's to give a square to the f8 square to this bishop. Rook takes a more centralized position and the bishop comes to f8. Why does the bishop come to f8? Because Aronian wants to chase the queen away with g6, but he can't do that without the bishop on f8 because then the pawn on h6 would drop. So now he's in a position to play g6, and that's what he does after Caruana does two things. He makes an escape square for his king so he can't get back ranked, and also he opens up the possibility of playing knight to e2, g4. But first the queen gets attacked and Caruana retreats to h4. It looks like he might be threatening to play bishop takes pawn here because it's covered twice, but then the rook can eventually come to h7 and attack the bishop, and it's pinned to the queen. I say eventually because this rook would then be undefended, so he has to find a way to defend the rook on f6 first. And he defends it with queen to e7, so that the pawn cannot be taken on h6. But now he threatens the pawn on g6. Bishop comes to g7. Of course, he can't take the pawn yet because it's defended by the rook. The knight comes to a5. It looks like a bit of a poor place to do a trade, but of course he's not looking for a trade. He has something else in mind completely. So the knight's taken on a5, and Caruana takes the pawn on e5, so that he's also now threatening to take this pawn. So for his knight, he's getting 2 pawns, and he's opening up lines against the queen, against the king, attacking lines. So excellent. And he takes the pawn and threatens the queen. So he's got 2 pawns for his knight. Not a bad deal. Actually, a knight's better than 2 pawns, but when those 2 pawns are an important part of the king's defences. Who knows what's most valuable? I would much rather play white here than black. And the pawn attacks the bishop, the rook even, on e5. So whilst it doesn't have many places to retreat to, and the king comes to f5, and the pawn defends the pawn on e5 so they can then think about playing knight here to attack the rook again. Pawn comes to c5, and the knight attacks the rook anyway. And the rook comes to h5, and then the knight comes to f3 to put more pressure on this square and this square. King comes to h7 so that the bishop isn't any longer pinned to the king. And the queen threatens the rook and the knight and the pawn on e6. So the rook must go to f5 to defend both. And the knight comes, and of course now the rook doesn't have anywhere to go. But Aronian probably thinks, yeah, well, 2 knights against the rook, that's quite a good deal for me. But it's 2 knights against a rook and 2 pawns, so that's maybe a better deal for white. And of course, white is also in the position that he's trying to play check here and pick up this pawn for free. So the king retreats so that that isn't free, and he takes the pawn, and the rook takes. And yeah, we've got 2 knights for a rook, but white has all 8 pawns and black has only 6. So it's a rook and 2 pawns against 2 knights. 2 knights are worth 6, a rook's worth 5, and 2 pawns are worth 2, so 7. 7-6, a theoretical material advantage for white. But also it's a big positional advantage. The king is very exposed. Caruana's king's perfectly safe. And he has good ways of maybe creating pass pawns on the king's side. So the queen comes to g6 again to threaten the pawn and to threaten the rook. So queen comes to e7 to protect the pawn, and the rook is chased away. And the pawns carry on storming. And Aronian thinks, well, if I get rid of the queens, he won't have the same attack on the king side. No, he won't, but he will still have a fantastic attack of the pawns, and the bishop has to retreat to f8. And the pawn comes forward, 1 square away from queening now, threatens the rook. And the rook comes to threaten the pawn. So he's threatening to get a 3rd pawn, and a rook and 3 pawns for 2 knights is an even better deal for Caruana. So knight was attacked there anyway, and tries to come to d7 to play a better defensive role. Pawn is taken, and if bishop takes, then rook takes bishop, and even if the king comes here, then the rook comes here and he's threatening to queen the pawn. So he threatens the rook at the same time as defending the f8 square with the knight. And Caruana says, yeah, take my rook. Take my rook. I'll play this position. A whole piece down. This is no problem. Piece down for 3 pawns, with these pawns being the pawns. Easily going to win this. And he's not wrong. So he swaps off and says check. And now the rook comes to g5, and Aronian resigns because queen to rook to h, g4 check, and pawn here will be fatal. And yeah, he will be getting a new queen. And yeah, he will get the knight for the pawn. It's just a hopeless situation for Aronian. So now Caruana remarkably has beaten Topalov, MBL, Magnus Carlsen, and Levon Aronian. The next in line is Hikaru Nakamura. We'll see how that goes tomorrow. Yeah, don't forget to like, share, subscribe and comment on my videos. Thanks. Bye.